The man who stayed in a war for 29 years. Intro. Just imagine. The world had long forgotten a war that had ended years earlier, yet you were still living as if it had never ended. Not for a few days, not for a few months, but for 29 years. It sounds almost impossible to believe, like something straight out of a movie script or a fictional novel. But no, this story is completely real. Hidden among the dense jungles of the Philippines, one man refused to believe that World War II had ever come to an end. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and what he experienced would become one of the most extraordinary stories in modern history. The order that changed his life. It was December 1944. Japan had begun retreating across the Pacific, and the end of the war was slowly coming into view. At just 22 years old, Hiroo Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines as an intelligence officer. Right before his departure, his commanding officer gave him his final instructions. Perhaps those few words spoken that day would determine the course of Onoda's entire life. His commander told him, "No matter what happens, you must never surrender. You must never take your own life. One day, we will come back for you." To Onoda, these were not ordinary orders. They were a mission that had to be fulfilled, no matter the cost. But at that moment, he had no idea of the long years that awaited him. The war ended for the world, but not for him. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. With that, World War II officially came to an end. People all around the world celebrated victory, and soldiers returned home. But Hiroo Onoda, who was hiding in the mountains of Lubang Island, knew nothing about it. He continued living alongside 3 fellow Japanese soldiers. After some time, leaflets began falling from the sky. Newspapers were distributed. The messages stated that the war was over. But Onoda believed it was all part of an enemy deception. He thought it was a trap designed to force them into surrendering. As a result, he trusted none of the messages, and he continued carrying out his mission. Years passed, and the world changed. Life in the jungle was far from easy. They survived on fruit, coconuts, and rice they occasionally managed to obtain. They constantly moved from place to place and slept out in the open at night. To avoid being captured, they stayed away from people. As the years went by, the group gradually fell apart. One of them surrendered, another lost his life. Years later, the last remaining companion was killed during a confrontation with the police. And one day, Hiroo Onoda found himself completely alone in the jungle, but even loneliness wasn't enough to change his mind. For him, surrender was still unthinkable. The outside world had become something entirely different. While Onoda continued living in the jungle, the world was changing rapidly. Television had entered people's homes. Humanity had set foot on the moon. The Beatles had become beloved by millions. New nations had been born, and technology had transformed everyday life. But Onoda knew nothing about any of it. In his mind, the war was still going on, and he was still a soldier carrying out his duty. The encounter no one expected. In 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set high. He told his friends, "I'm going to find a panda. I'm going to find the Yeti. And I'm going to find Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda." Most people thought it was impossible. But then something unexpected happened. Suzuki actually managed to find Onoda. The two met deep in the jungle. Suzuki explained that the war had ended years ago, that Japan had rebuilt itself, and that the world had changed completely. But Onoda refused to believe him, because for him there was only one person whose word truly mattered: his former commanding officer. The final order that ended the war. Years later, the Japanese government tracked down Onoda's former commander, Yoshimi Taniguchi. By then, Taniguchi was living an ordinary civilian life. He traveled to the Philippines and came face to face with Onoda, and officially informed him that the mission he had given nearly 30 years earlier had finally come to an end. And at that very moment, the duty he had carried out for 29 years was over. At last, Onoda laid down his weapon. When he emerged from the jungle, he was still wearing his uniform. His sword was still by his side, and the rifle he had carried all those years was still in working condition. For him, the war had finally come to an end. Outro. But oh, Hiroo. Onoda's story remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in World War II. Because sometimes history is stranger than fiction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.